guy who started, who's Joe.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started with today's presentation. We're talking about iconic shipwrecks today with Dr. James Delgado, who is an expert at the topic at hand. So we thank him for coming. Just wanted to go over a few housekeeping rules for the presentation. If you can remember to please mute yourself throughout, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. If you do have questions, please use the chat box feature for any questions that you have throughout the presentation, and then we'll get to them all after the presentation. For your viewing pleasure, be sure to put your computer in speaker view until the Q&A portion so you can see the full screen of the actual presentation, and then grab a beverage of choice and sit back and enjoy. I will next get to our introductions. First, I'd like to introduce our president and CEO, Mike Carr of the USS Missouri Memorial Association.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Jacqueline, for your effort in setting all this up. I'm really looking forward to this as much as all the rest of you. We are very fortunate today to have Dr. James Delgado as our resource, an incredible resource. Dr. Delgado has led and participated in over 100 shipwreck missions, including many lost warships, as well as the Titanic. He's passionately dedicated to exploration, and for the past decade, he has increasingly focused on deep ocean exploration, new technologies for reaching not only the deep, but worldwide audiences through the use of robotic vehicles, satellites, and the internet to bring the public along with him as he explores all these oceans. He currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Search Inc., the nation's largest company devoted to archaeology, historic preservation, and museum services. And historic preservation, of course, is what we are all about here at the Missouri. So it is my deep, deep pleasure to introduce to all of you Dr. James Delgado.
Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and my only regret is that I'm not out in Honolulu with all of you, as it is one of my favorite places, and one which, as I think you'll see, I've spent a fair amount of time working. We'll go to the ocean is the largest aspect of our planet, and its importance can't be underrated. It is more than just a big, vast body of water. It's the source of over half the world's food. It is our greatest frontier. It was, and it continues to be. It's the means by which, as people, we spread across the globe. It is the main driver of our weather, and it is also, in many ways, the biggest generator of the oxygen, the air that we breathe. But it's also our largest museum, as well as our largest battlefield and our greatest graveyard. In that, ships that have crossed the waters starting tens of thousands of years ago, up till more recent times, have left their bones scattered not only on shorelines, but in the deeper waters of the ocean. In my career, which now stretches more than, it's stretching into its 5th decade now, I've been privileged to work, as you've heard, on a number of shipwrecks. Many of those shipwrecks have been powerful and iconic ones. Others have not been, but just the same, they remain subject to much of my fascination. I'm just going to be right up front at the start and say that I am still the passionate 6th grader who fell in love with history, thanks to my teachers. And with that, embarked on what continues to be a lifelong mission of learning. And as I learn, then sharing. And that learning will never end. The idea of shipwrecks as historical events certainly has been compelling, but it's shipwrecks sitting on the bottom of the ocean, ranging in time span from more than 3,000 years ago to more recent wrecks that have increasingly captured my attention. That started rather early on as well, but it wasn't until I was 20 and I got to go to the 6th Army's dive school and Presidio San Francisco that I was able to finally get down there and start reaching shipwrecks for myself. In that, certainly as a marine or a maritime archaeologist, as I've started that career and as I've continued with it, I've encountered these wrecks, and I've also got to know many others thanks to the work of other colleagues. And that vast museum of the sea speaks to early trade. Well, the oldest shipwreck yet found and completely excavated off the coast of Turkey, some 3,300 years old, has elements and trade goods from 12 separate civilizations that span the Baltic to subequatorial Africa, to the Levant coast of today's Israel and the Middle East, throughout the Mediterranean. In short, these folks had their own global economy. So there's certain things that aren't necessarily new. They have been done before, just in different ways. And also at times, not so much in different ways. For me, it's that aspect of the past that's particularly powerful. It is understanding the human experience and how shipwrecks reflect that experience, not only in terms of tragedy, but also in a variety of other stories that has compelled me. But one aspect of the career that I wanted to share today is that concept of the iconic shipwreck. What makes an iconic shipwreck? Well, in these days, I guess one could imagine that it's a vessel that has a certain amount of media attention, whether it's something that has its own Facebook page or is constantly tweeted about or is in the news, something like the recent discovery of Ernest Shackleton's Endurance. There's an iconic shipwreck. And there's an iconic shipwreck because it's not only made the news, it's an iconic shipwreck because it also speaks to a powerful story, a story that still compels us in the case of Shackleton more than a century later. Or there's ships that, like ghosts from the past, have emerged and captured our attention. Here you see the Swedish royal ship Vasa, built in 1629, capsized on its maiden voyage in Stockholm Harbor, and sitting in that worm-free environment of the cold Baltic in Stockholm Harbor, remained there more or less intact until it was rediscovered in the late 1950s and was raised, pumped out, and then its decks were cleared and cleaned by archaeologists and workers, revealing a vast time capsule that spoke to this regalskipet, or this royal ship of King Gustavus Adolphus Vasa. Another example of a ship perhaps not so intact that also became iconic was when it was discovered, the long-sought wreck of King Henry VIII's Mary Rose, lost in 1545 in a battle with the French, also captured attention and became iconic, in part, I guess, of course, because it's associated with Henry VIII. And above and beyond that whole question of the 6 wives and his tendency to behead a few of them, it's Henry's role as the founder, basically, of Britain's Royal Navy that also came to the fore. But it's the fact, too, that Mary Rose, when discovered, even though half of it was gone and had been taken away by the fast currents of the Solent, what was left buried in that mud was a time capsule that spoke to the ship, the artifacts on board it, some of the earliest bronze guns. This is a time when these guys are going from shooting bows and arrows and throwing axes and huge iron bars called gads from the foretop down onto the deck of the other ship to actually piercing a hull and putting guns into it. And in that as well, finding the remains of some of the crew who in some cases told their own stories. The DNA suggested that some of them were actually French mercenaries fighting their fellow countrymen, as well as some folks who at an early age had been trained to be the archers that fired the great English longbows. And you could see that because bones, particularly when we're young, are almost plastic in a way, and they shape and mold themselves according to the strains and the stresses or the exercise we do. And with that, they could see that these guys who could fire a bow that was so difficult to pull back that modern people really couldn't do it. But training from an early age as boys, these guys had deformed wrist bones, finger bones, and even where the tendons had been attached to their shoulders and on their backs, just due to the strain. And you could actually see that 400 years later in their bones. Actually, they're still present, and a reminder of what they had undergone and trained for, and then ultimately had been lost when the ship went down. Those are some of the things that make an iconic ship. And as a young archaeologist studying some of these projects and also seeing them happen, of course, we all want, as archaeologists or as explorers, to encounter iconic ships of our own. After all, that's one of the attractions of USS Missouri. Missouri is an icon, and thankfully for all of us, It's not sitting on the bottom of the ocean. It's there, capable of visits and still living and working and sharing the stories of Missouri and its crews. So what I'm going to do is share some perspectives on a few of the iconic shipwrecks that I've had the privilege to work on in my career, and what has compelled me about those ships and why I still remain passionate about them and continue to work on them, and on occasion write about them or make a film. The earliest work I did, incidentally, was with ships that were not sunk but buried in landfill in downtown San Francisco that related to the Great California Gold Rush of 1849. When the waterfront was filled in and created a new modern San Francisco, a number of those ships were buried, some of them practically intact, in 1851, 52, and all the way up to 1855. Modern development has exposed some of those bones, and I've had the privilege of standing on the deck of a ship that sailed into San Francisco in 1849 and then was subsequently buried, and stuck in that cold, thick mud without air getting in, was so preserved that literally you could walk the decks. That perhaps was my first iconic ships or group of ships in a way, because the gold rush is a famous part of American history. But the first real iconic ship that compelled me was the USS Monitor. Now, Monitor, having been built in the Civil War as part of the advent of the modern age of naval fighting, a time in which wooden ships gave way to ironclads that both the Union and the Confederacy had developed. And with that clash in March of 1861 between CSS Virginia, the former Merrimack, and the Monitor, history changed forever as these two ironclad behemoths pounded each other into a draw. For each side, while they declared victory, Monitor certainly captured more of the attention. To this day, why some people will still say, when you get a promise, that's an ironclad guarantee. It's the whole question of this tiny little ship, a cheese box on a raft, as it was referred to, that everybody laughed at, that they didn't think would work. The harbinger of a new age, not only with iron, but with a rotating turret that changed that naval warfare. And a Monitor became, for many people, the ship that saved the Union. Because at that time, in that early stage of the war, with the Union fleet there at Hampton Roads, blockading that port and capable of striking, if they went up the river, the Confederate capital at Richmond, out comes Virginia, and in short order on that first morning of the Battle of Hampton Roads, devastates the Union fleet, sinking the USS Cumberland, damaging and sinking others. And then the next morning, as they come to finish it off, there they find this tiny little cheeky Yankee craft built by New York firms under the direction and with the designs of Swedish-American inventor John Ericsson. And with that, as they fire at each other, they can dent, but they can't really sink one another. Monitor became famous, and as such, when it was lost less than a year later in a storm off of Cape Hatteras, sinking on New Year's Eve, when it was overwhelmed by a storm and the USS Rhode Island had to cut it free, Monitor sank with 16 of its crew, 230 feet down, 16 miles off of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, into what today is still known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. When Monitor was rediscovered by John Newton and others in 1974, I think everybody was fascinated. Certainly the idea of finding Monitor, the thought that Monitor might still be down on the bottom, had compelled a number of searches. But when Monitor was found and those very first images came back, like that cutout mosaic looking down with a camera in black and white, it led to Monitor becoming the first national marine sanctuary in the United States, but also a shipwreck that was named a National Historic Landmark. And I got to know Monitor because I was the young Park Service archaeologist and historian assigned to do that work, to see Monitor designated as a national landmark. With that, and subsequently then working for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, who runs marine sanctuaries, as the Director of Maritime Heritage, I got to know Monitor very well. And of course, with Monitor, what we've seen is not only declaring it important and putting it in a marine sanctuary, but also doing ongoing work to investigate it, to study it, and ultimately to raise portions of it. Dives on Monitor commenced early on to assess its condition, and so a limited amount of archaeology was done. And you gotta love it. It's almost as if it's out of a Clive Cussler novel to realize that when the last thing they saw of Monitor before it sank in that dark night was a single red signal lantern hanging from a spar atop the turret. Many times, they said, from the Rhode Island, they could see the Monitor struggle in the trough of the waves, a dead ship now without power, drifting back and forth, rocking. And then finally that light went out and the Monitor was no more. What the fire of the enemy had failed to do, the ocean had, and Monitor was gone. With the discovery and with the first dives, what do they find sitting on the seabed before they get right up to the wreck? But that very lantern itself. You gotta love it. It's something you'd find only in a book, but occasionally books are written based on what really happens. So between the dives and understanding and inspecting Monitor, what also came to pass was an understanding that Monitor was in trouble, that Monitor needed some intervention. Let's go to the next one. And that led to a series of projects working with the US Navy and with the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia, which had been established as the repository for all things Monitor by the government. Among those items raised and recovered were the engines, as well as the propeller, its very unique anchor, and finally, the turret, which was one of the defining features that made Monitor so different. As the turret was raised and came up, initial excavation inside the turret before it was raised indicated that it was still packed with sediment and that it had things in it. Things that would be very important in telling the story. And by the way, there you see that lantern. Among the items found included boots that men had cast off so that they could swim in those heavy seas, as well as a pea coat that had been carried by somebody and left behind, but also a whole range of other items that included silverware from the officers' mess that somebody was trying to take and recover, and the bodies of two of Monitor's sailors. Many of those artifacts, as I think we see, spoke to the people, to life on board, but also to the moment of Monitor's death, as well as the loss of those 16. Certainly there you see the boot again. You can see things perfectly preserved, the button off of an overcoat and the wedding ring that was on the finger of one of the skeletons that lay at the bottom of the turret. With all of this work, high technology also comes into play. Monitor needed to have, once these parts came up, a plan not only to protect and preserve that which still remained, but also to deal with what had come up. After all that time in the seawater, the salt gets into the iron and begins to rust and take it apart. Other things may look strong, but will disintegrate once they dry out. So the first duty was to document everything. Once cleared, the turret was laser scanned, as you can see here. Drawings were made that pinpointed where everything was, and as you look inside, you can still see the two massive guns that had fired in anger against the Virginia on that March morning in 1861. And once those guns came out, then more work could happen getting down into the very lower spaces. One of the more interesting things is once they cleaned the scale, the rust that had formed, each of the guns had been engraved after the Battle of Hampton Roads. And if you see that there, this is the gun named for Erickson, and that the lettering was still there and still in place. A rare moment from the past when it looks so clear, and even though it's starting to rust a bit again, you literally seem to be just a step away from those who had fought in that battle or who had indeed engraved those guns. For all of us who've had a chance to be in the turret, I think it's a reminder too that this once remote space that had seen so much important history happen now is accessible. My last interactions with Monitor before I retired from NOAA involved what best to do with those two bodies that had been found. They remained in a lab in Honolulu, comprehensive at the lab.
See your teeth.
I'm sorry. Did somebody have a question? Okay. The skeletons were analyzed and assessed, DNA was extracted, but no positive identification could be made. No match to anybody that was known to be a descendant of those who had served on Monitor. Didn't mean that there wasn't a match, just the DNA potentially was too degraded or just couldn't positively be matched. These days, who knows, maybe we could have done a bit more, but up until 2016, 2013, this was still an evolving science. And so these guys stayed on that shelf in the lab in Honolulu. A number of us wanted to see them honored, and the idea was to bury them at Arlington. But Arlington has very strict rules that no further unidentified shall be interred at the cemetery. So with that, what best to do? We went back and forth, and finally, working with the comprehensive, with the forensics lab at Louisiana State University, using CSI crime lab techniques, we rebuilt their faces with Dr. Mary Markheim and her team, and then photoshopped them a bit so that ultimately we could present more than just two skulls to the American public. But as we unveiled these reconstructions at the National Naval Memorial in Washington, D.C., we could point out that these were actually once living people who'd served and had paid the ultimate price for that service, but also that while we may not know who they were, their mothers would have recognized them. In fact, in one case, we think the older guy, the guy with the dark hair, may very well be the gentleman in the photograph of all the crew with the leather cap all the way over to one side with his arms crossed and the handlebar mustache. He's a potential contender. We know who he is. And while the DNA couldn't give us an exact match because we didn't get a descendant of that guy, a number of the features seem to confirm it. But again, without an absolute positive identification, what do you do? What we ultimately determined was, and I don't know why the idea didn't come up earlier, was there was no stone, no memorial to all 16 who died on Monitor. Families had put up a cenotaph, basically a marker for an empty grave in a couple of cases, but that was it. So in a meeting at the Pentagon with the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, I finally said, sir, why don't we just put a marker up with everybody's name on it? That way I can guarantee that you have the right two names for the guys you buried. And it worked. And so there it was. We were able to reinter those two men, flew them back from Hawaii with full honors and buried them at Arlington. That may, for now, be the end of the circuit for me with the iconic Monitor. But what's still powerful for me and what I reflect on, as I think you can see, is it's more than an ironclad. It's more than a battle. It's more than the technology. It's more than the archaeology. It's the story of people. That certainly was the case at the same time I was working on Monitor when I was asked to come to Pearl Harbor and start working on USS Arizona with my colleagues from the National Park Service's Submerged Cultural Resources Center. My job was to do the paperwork and the detailed studies that would see the Arizona and the USS Utah designated National Historic Landmarks, a rare honor for shipwrecks. Well, the iconic moment when that shell hit the powder and deflagrated inside Arizona in that catastrophic moment that killed so many of the crew, that certainly was one aspect of what makes Arizona an iconic ship. It was a symbol of December 7th, 1941, and remains powerfully so. But as well, though that canted, burning wreck with its foremast toppled forward became one of the most iconic images of the attack, and ultimately set the stage for the ultimate placement of the Arizona Memorial over the wreck, which could not be salvaged and remains the tomb of its dead crew. Arizona spoke to more than just that. It spoke to more than December 7th, 1941. And in that, what we ended up doing was trying to better understand and to take a ship that the memorial spanned, where you could see a few things sticking out of the water, and give people a sense of what it still looked like and what it was. And in that, in those early dives, and I apologize, these are black and white because they were all taken in the 1980s. Here you see what it was like when by hand, the Park Service began to map and draw and document USS Arizona. Among the finds that were made included, of course, the The guns at the #1 turret still in place and depressed and broken. Dishes, silverware from a breakfast forever interrupted on that morning, and the tangle of fire hoses that were dropped exactly where the crews were working when the final blast came and literally engulfed them in a fireball, and they were gone. And all that remains are the hoses played out to where they were fighting those fires. To everything that falls in from the Arizona Memorial that Park Service still picks up. And that's more than just sunglasses, coins, these days cell phones or cameras, hair clips. In many cases, back when we were doing this, what we were also seeing were not only flowers, but letters and photographs. And when you were floating down there, and there's just a few feet of water and the sun dappling through, and you see a fading photograph of an older woman with younger men, with younger women alongside them, with children in front of them. What we were all struck by was these were the widows of December 7th, the Arizona guys who didn't make it off the ship, sharing with their dead that life had gone on and the children had grown up and these were their grandchildren. It was pretty profound, and it's one of the reasons why I think Arizona is an icon. And those of us in the Park Service who saw that certainly understood then what happened when a few years later we began work on it in Washington, D.C., saw the Vietnam Memorial come into the system and start to be visited with everything being left there. Icons are shrines as well. The work that we did with archaeologist Larry Nordby there, taking the lead with archaeologist Jerry Livingston, along with Daniel Lenihan and Larry Murphy, was to draw and to map Arizona. And that certainly gave people a sense of the ship. But what we also did in this work was to model that, to give folks a sense of exactly what Arizona looked like, what it still resembled and what the battle damage was. Because Arizona to this day still bears the scars of that moment. More recently, photography has improved, and now we are able to share not only photographs, but the Park Service through the Arizona Memorial on special occasions will lead ranger-led guided dives where with a full face mask and a camera, they take people around and over Arizona to give people a sense of what lies beneath the memorial. And some of those features that we saw back then are still in place. Intact tile from the mess hall, the silverware from that breakfast, a variety of other things, pots, pans, and yes, the ubiquitous Coke bottles from the start of World War II. But what we also saw was that Arizona was changing over time. The oil that continues to leak was there, and I will always remember floating over the deck and watching as a blob of oil came up every few seconds to slick on the surface and form that shimmer of oil on the water that then drifts over the wreck, past the Missouri and out into the harbor. More recently, scans using new technologies have given us a sense of Arizona once again, this time using modern technologies like lasers. Nicely enough, by the way, and a testament to my colleagues with all the work they did decades ago, is that the laser scans and the drawings match up practically to the centimeter. It's that close. That's how good the work was that was done by Dan, Larry, Jerry, and the other Larry. And with that, nowadays, with the modern technology, what you can see separate from the lasers is just what happened when that bomb went off and basically created this volcanic crater where the #1 turret dropped and fell, the gun mounts broken, the forward area of the deck peeled back, sediment now filling that area, but a garden of twisted steel that we've all swum through and around as we've dived off the bow. And then just above and aft of that, the #2 turret, its guns removed, its sidewalls still in place, and with the very tops of those exposed more often than not at lower water. More recently too, because the ship has stories to tell and because it's important to learn more about it, but also to help tell those stories. After consultation with the Navy and with families, the Park Service has begun to investigate the interior of Arizona. Back in my day, we did not go into Arizona. It was considered risky, but also we wanted to deal with the question of respect for the families of those who had been lost in the ship. Where we were fortunate enough to work is in an area of the vessel, and I say fortunate, in that we knew that we would not be disturbing anyone because those aft areas of the hull had been dewatered by the Navy, and those who had been lost and who were still inside the ship were taken out and buried at the punch bowl. Here you see a photograph of one of those spaces. Here we are, by the hoists here in the turret, and the water is still leaking through, but with the pumps going, the Navy could go through and do their work. That's since reflooded, and right after they turned the pumps off. And so working in these spaces where we would not encounter nor disturb anyone's eternal rest, the Park Service has flown through and examined these. And here you see the track of one of those tiny little robotic vehicles as it's worked its way through. And in that, when you go in, what you see are amazing things. This is in an officer's cabin. That is his uniform hanging there, coated in oil and preserved in place as documented by that robotic vehicle. Again, for me, what it speaks to and what makes Arizona important, having met a number of those survivors, having shared their stories, and actually on one occasion, having been among the team that interred the ashes of one of those survivors back in the number 4 turrets, so that he could join his shipmates for eternity. It's people. Another wreck that ultimately drew my attention at the time, and then subsequently, was the Nevada. Nevada, of course, moored aft of Arizona, got underway thanks to the heroic action of its crew and its junior officers with a hole blown in the side by a Japanese torpedo as big as a barn door, they said. Nevada made a gallant run out of Pearl Harbor as the Japanese tried to sink the vessel, and finally, damaged and burning, was beached at Waipio, and there settled down, partially sunk, had its fires put out. Nevada is a ship that would not die, and that was its legend, and it's one of the things that made it iconic. Raised and repaired, Nevada went back into the fight in World War II and fought on both sides of the conflict, both in the Atlantic theater, shelling the Germans at D-Day, and then coming back into the Pacific and engaging in shore support and naval gunfire activities, as well as fighting off kamikazes in the Pacific and off of Okinawa. Then Nevada, as one of the older and toughest ships in the Navy, was selected as the main target for the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll that took place in July of 1946. Here you see the Able test, or the airdropped weapon, of July 1st, 1946. Nevada was supposed to be hit by that bomb. Painted bright international orange and with a strobe on its mast flashing, it was set up to be that target with a radio beacon also guiding in the B-29 Dave's Dream under the command of Major Woodrow Swancutt. When they entered the lagoon that early morning, flew over and dropped that single implosion core plutonium weapon, the same type of weapon that had been previously used at Nagasaki. The bomb missed Nevada by over a mile. It scorched it and knocked antennas around and certainly set a few fires going on the paint, but not much else, though other ships were more badly damaged. And as you can see, the Japanese cruiser Sakawa is sinking just in the foreground off of Nevada on Able Day +1, right after the first test. Nevada remained for the second test of the underwater deployed bomb on July 25th, and again, largely undamaged but heavily irradiated, joined other target ships that had not sunk at Bikini to go back to Pearl Harbor and be assessed and studied, and hopefully to give it a chance to cool off a bit. I became more familiar with all of these vessels because in my Park Service tenure, we went out to Bikini and worked with the US Navy and others to document the ships sunk during the A-bomb tests, from the aircraft carrier Saratoga, CV-3, to the destroyers Anderson and Lamson, the attack transports Gilliam and Carlisle, the iconic Japanese battleship Nagato, one of the first ships in the world to have 16-inch naval guns, and whose shells had been modified. And indeed, one of those shells modified had been the fatal bullet that had sunk the Arizona. And the submarines Pilot, Fish, and Apagon, and so on. Nevada had always fascinated me, again, because of the work we'd done on Arizona. And following the work with the A-bomb tests, I'd always wanted to see what we could do to find it. But Nevada had been taken out to sea 64 miles off of Pearl and sunk in a naval gunfire exercise as well as an aerial assault. And again, it took 5 days to sink the Nevada because it really was a ship that refused to die. In the end, having been hit by torpedoes and shelled by the USS Iowa, Nevada slipped its bonds and fell to the bottom of the sea some 3 miles deep at a spot more or less vaguely known and then still classified logbooks, but never forgotten. When COVID struck, I finally had an opportunity to see what we could do. And with our good friends at Ocean Infinity, who have a suite of instruments capable of surveying the deep ocean, we worked with them as they were changing crews out at Honolulu and said, if you've got some time, COVID is rampant, we can't send anybody out. Indeed, as you'll all recall, when the pandemic started, there was a lot of upset, as there still is. But with that, there were certain pundits saying, what a terrible thing. Will we get through this? How will we get through this? And I was reminded of the resilience of not only Nevada, but Nevada's crew, and indeed the entire nation after the Pearl Harbor attack. If there was ever something we could do to remind everybody about how stubborn and resilient the American spirit was, I thought it'd be to go find Nevada. So working with them, we used their autonomous underwater vehicles. These little uncrewed submersibles are capable of diving down to 3 miles deep. They can work for well over a day using battery power. They can map using high definition sonar. They can take pictures. And then, unlike your average teenager, because they do carry their own version of a cell phone, they will call you if you're not there to pick them up. So with these instruments deployed, dropped down, and in the matter of a day, working from the logbook work, we'd done 100 square mile area was searched. And when they came back up, the sonar map that they developed showed us the broken hull of Nevada upside down, and around it, a vast field of everything that had come off of the ship as a result of the shelling, the torpedoings, and then its capsizing. Here you can see the main hull of the battleship upside down. The bow, the tip of the bow and the tip of the stern were both broken off. But what we then did, and you can actually see the impact marks in the mud where Nevada slid in and slammed into the mud on a slope 3 miles deep, leaving those heavy marks both from the skidding as well as just the blowout from that heavy hull hitting. We sent a robot down at the end of a cable to take a look at it, and all of us were working separately. I did and helped run this dive from Florida, satellite tied in using a system known as telepresence, while the crew there worked. So in a way, it was a perfect pandemic mission. Everybody was socially distant. And yet we worked together as a team to take the first look at Nevada since she had died in 1948. There is the stern of Nevada with the draft marks still painted so they could assess the level of sinking if it had been damaged by the A-bomb. There's the bow. Excuse me, we're still at the stern. A turret upside down and lying in the mud where it had fallen and hit into the seabed. But as well, items like this tank, which had been put on board, the Army placed a number of items on the ships as test platforms to see what the bomb would do with them. Everything from 5,000 test animals that ranged from pigs and goats and rats to samples of uniform, every type of weapon we had, including tanks like this one. And this once classified drawing shows where all of those were placed on the aft deck of USS Nevada. But again, as well, a reminder that it's not just things, it's people. You see that down there, while some corrosion is starting to happen, you could see portions of the berthing compartment that you see there and what had once been the casemate. You can see the engravings still in place in this handling room for one of the 5-inch guns and a seaman's locker. Nobody went down with this ship, but certainly what went down with the ship was everything that spoke to it being the floating home from World War I all the way through to the end, or the start, I should say, of the atomic age. For me, again, a reminder that the story of Nevada was that of people. And then we all had to laugh when we came up to the back of this turret and saw that a leading seaman had left a little tag behind during the A-bomb test, figuring nobody'd ever see that because after all, it was about to be hit by an atomic bomb. We still haven't been in touch with whoever's leading seaman Lope's family, or, nobody's stepped forward first, but it brought a smile to our face to see this very human thing on this iconic battleship lit up for briefly, a brief moment, I should say, as we investigated and explored it. The other wreck from the A-bomb tests that we'd also wanted to look at was the carrier, and that was the USS Independence. What the bomb did when it missed Nevada was badly maul the Mighty I, which was one of the first of a smaller Independence class carriers, small CVLs that have been built on cruiser hulls to carry out the war, particularly as we needed more carriers. A number of folks fought hard in these vessels. Independence actually inaugurated night fighting, and former presidents George Bush and Gerald Ford both flew aircraft off of Independence class carriers. Independence, as I said, had been hit and mauled by the Able bomb on July 1st and heavily irradiated, remained in place. They cleaned off a few things, put new planes on to see what the bomb would do with them, and then tried to sink it with the Baker test, but that did not do it. And so Independence, like Nevada and others, was towed away, came to California, where it was then set up at Hunters Point to become the Navy's founding focal point of what would become the National Radiological Defense Laboratory. In 1951, after years of study, Independence was loaded with used lab equipment, nuclear waste, which they defined at the time not as large glowing pieces of things, but materials from the other target ships that had been exposed, lab coats, instruments, you name it, sealed them in barrels, tapped them with concrete, and then towed her out 23 miles off San Francisco and sank Independence. With charges that would have been set off, sending her to the bottom. At the time, the location was not precisely noted. I mean, the Navy knew it. It was in the classified logbooks. It was said to be 100 miles off. And one of the reasons why they sank it was we'd already figured out that based on the residues of atomic weapons explosions, we could determine, basically the formula for plutonium. We didn't want the Soviets to have that. And so with fear of espionage and of the Russians trying to get to it, Independence was sent to the bottom, as were the other ships that were also starting to leak and no longer served any purpose. In this case, they were actually spraying radioactive material in the ships and using it to train radiological monitors in how to go in and respond in a shipboard emergency if your vessel had come through an atomic attack. When we found Independence, we did so first with a survey that was done by NOAA, where a squiggly caterpillar of sorts of sound imagery showed up at about 1,000 feet down off of Half Moon Bay. We came back a few years later and using an autonomous vehicle, flew over it, thanks to the generous donation of that vehicle and the time and the backing for it from the Boeing Corporation, and found Independence looking, as you see there in that sonar image, somewhat blurry, but certainly identifiable as the Mighty I, and with what we thought might be an airplane in that forward hangar. We were able to come back the following year using Dr. Robert Ballard's ship Nautilus, which has most recently been out at Pearl and working in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, using his robotic systems of known as the Hercules, and again with telepresence. In this case, though, we were all on the vessel and working. And here you see us in the control room on board Nautilus. That ghostly looking face floating, that is Dr. Ballard watching us all, with aviation archaeologist Russell Matthews, myself, archaeologist Dr. Michael Brennan, and then Navy oceanographer Admiral Tim Gallaudet, who later would be the administrator of NOAA. And 1,000 feet up, we're working with the team flying the robot as we investigate and explore and document USS Independence. It's rare that a ship actually tells you its name, but there you can see it if you can with the lights on. Well, covered with submarine growth, Independence still there in the raised letters at the stern. A pretty powerful moment for us. Everything still in place that had been there. A-bomb damage also noticeable. But here you see a pair of twin 40s still in place. And the aircraft that we found inside, one of the Navy fighters, still in place and with paint markings still there. So badly damaged in some ways, and yet also speaking to the fact that the ocean as a museum can also preserve things. Again, nobody went down with the Independence, but we certainly with this, we're talking to those who had served on it, as we did with some of the survivors of Nevada. And for them to see their old ship again for the first time, as we certainly saw back in 1989 and 1990 when we were diving on Saratoga and the other ships, or when we interacted with the other Pearl Harbor survivors, is it was an emotional moment for them. The war had been a time in which they had transitioned from boys and young women into men and grown women who'd served and fought and oftentimes paid a price for that. So it was a powerful moment, particularly with telepresence, where we could share that. So again, for me, what you see may be just a rusty, battered ship on the bottom, but again, something built by people, used by people, that reflected powerful human stories that still compel us and speak to us to this day. I'm going to close by saying that not every ship that I've dealt with that's iconic is famous. And sometimes you don't even have to go out to try to find them. They seemingly are found when the time is right. In 2013, we were doing a survey off of San Francisco near the Farallon Islands, 26 miles out, when in response to some newly released sonar data, we dropped down with our small robotic vehicle, 180 feet down, in a great white shark infested sea, to see a wreck sitting on the bottom that, as we investigated it, had all the features, as I saw, of a tugboat that had settled there, probably early 20th century, that had no distinguishing marks. But as we looked at it more and more, what gradually came to be was our sense was that it was likely a military tug. And then when the robotic vehicles found a gun, a naval gun forward, we then realized what we had found. And in that, we had solved a mystery that had nearly lasted a century, one of the last great 10 naval mysteries. And that was what had happened to the USS Conestoga, a fleet tug that had entered service in World War I, and while on its way to Pearl Harbor to then go to Samoa to be the station ship, had disappeared with all hands after sailing through the Golden Gate in June of 1921. As it turned out, Conestoga, a day out with a barge under tow, had to jettison the barge and fought its way in heavy seas and a swell to try to reach the safety of the naval radio station on Southeast Farallon Island, when 3.1 miles away from safety, with every hand at their station or strapped into their bunks, Conestoga and their crew lost the battle. Its crew lost their battle with the sea. 26 miles away from the point of departure. Conestoga's going missing was not immediately noted. And when the Navy started to search, it was the largest search ever in the history of the Navy by land, air, and sea. They walked some beaches and didn't see anything. But ships combed the area, and in fact, one of the Navy submarines out of Pearl Harbor ran out of fuel, and they actually had to sew hammocks together to create a makeshift sail that they lashed to the spars and to the periscope, and they sailed that submarine back to Pearl. They looked for thousands of square miles and wouldn't look more in any patch of ocean until Amelia Earhart went missing, but they could never find Conestoga because nobody thought to look so close to home. And so when this happened and when we found it, we then made sure, darn sure, that it was Conestoga, and then went to the Pentagon and met with everyone and said, this is what we found. The Navy doesn't have a combat casualty office that now deals with anything earlier than World War II. And so we volunteered as NOAA then to take on that task. We had a volunteer genealogist named Lisa Stansbury, and she began tracking down wherever possible those we could find from the 54 who had died on Conestoga, finding families. And I had the responsibility as the lead and the senior government person who led the survey with my colleague, Dr. Bob Schwemmer, to then go and call families and say, I'm calling on behalf of the United States government to let you know that we found your great uncle or your grandfather's ship at last. It was not easy at times. It was powerful. There were tears, there was anger, there was gratitude. It was profound in many ways. And in that, the reminder once more was what made Conestoga iconic wasn't that it was in the newspapers and in the headlines briefly in 1921, and then it went away. It's iconic because it meant something to families who wondered for all of those decades, would somebody ever show up? Would they ever come home? An unresolved, unanswered loss is one of the most terrible things, and it happens too many times, particularly in service and sacrifice for our country. And so to be able to bring closure to those families was perhaps one of the more profound and powerful things I've been privileged to do in my service to the country. We had a memorial service at the Navy Memorial. We rang that bell 54 times, and we honored all of those who had gone down with Conestoga. And in that also answered a question, in as much as everything, despite the vagaries of the damage and the ravages of time, everything was in place, and the clear message was these guys had done their job right up to the last moment, as they would have, and what we would expect, and as we know for those who serve. This band of brothers sailing together had not failed each other until the sea proved too powerful, and then nobody failed. Everybody just paid the price of a powerful sea that takes as much as it gives. And so there you have it. In my career, a series of iconic shipwrecks, iconic in many ways, that ultimately for me come back to that quintessential point. And that quintessential point is, it is all about people. I'm an archaeologist because I care about people, and I care about people's stories. And what the past can tell us is not only how different we are, but how alike we are, and how we have not changed as a species in the tens of thousands of years that we have had versions of our various civilizations. And in that time, there have always been those who have had to go and sail in harm's way so that others might live, that they would enjoy the freedoms that they have. And while we think of that service and sacrifice, particularly on the two holidays throughout the year, or when we visit a ship like Missouri, we don't often think about that in terms of all those ships that rest at the bottom of the sea, unless you're a family who had somebody that was on that ship and went down with it, or who survived and told you the stories, or perhaps didn't tell you those stories. And in that, that's why we do what we do. We find these things, we share these stories, and in that we honor those. Some of those who are now gone, like Admiral Ross, who I had the privilege to meet, one of the Medal of Honor winners and the heroes of Nevada's brave sortie out of Battleship Row on December 7th, 1941. And all of those who, unlike Don Ross, remained eternally young. I'm not done. Yet with ships and shipwrecks, there are many others that we continue to work on. And yes, indeed, from the merchant side of things, yes, Titanic has been a profound and powerful experience diving on that, again, as an iconic ship, as well as the work I'm currently engaged in, which is the archaeological excavation after the identification of a schooner in the muddy waters of the Mobile River in Alabama that proves to be Clotilda, the last ship known to bring people from Africa to make them slaves in 1860, just before the advent of the Civil War. Again, a very powerful place and a powerful site with a descendant community whose ancestors were captured and brought to America in that vessel. It's a vast museum, and every time you turn around, I'm sure you're going to see a news story or a reminder or meet somebody who's connected to one of these ships or shipwrecks. In that, remember them not so much as something which is rusty or broken on the bottom, but the ships that they once were, but also remember those who poured heart and soul into them and oftentimes went to the bottom with them and remained there. But also remember the power and the importance of a ship like Missouri, which afloat and capable of being visited is its own icon and speaks to the very same things. And you don't have to dive to see it. And it does need your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Delgado. That was an amazing presentation. I think we all learned a lot from that. We do have a few minutes for Q&A, so I invite everyone to put your questions in the chat room and I'll moderate those to Dr. Delgado. We have a little bit of time for that, so please go ahead and submit your questions now. I do have one to kind of kick us off. You shared a lot of the iconic warships that you visited and emphasized the importance of the human stories behind them. Is there one particular dive that you've done or a wreck that you visited that has been a very memorable moment for you or a powerful human story that you have never forgotten?
There are many, actually, each in their own way. For me, oftentimes when people ask, what was the most profound, what was the most amazing, which ones affected you the most? I think each of them have in their own way, and the ones that I haven't talked about tonight as well. But in that, I think what compels me and what I find powerful is the thought that there's still time and still opportunities, particularly as the technology improves, to go and find more. And that's what inspires me. What moves me now is the thought that working with partners and friends and others, we can find more of these ships. And we're now living in a period where that technology is making more and more of these discoveries possible, even at the bottom of the world in Antarctica. Just with that, yes, but I will also note that there are times when you confront something on the bottom that is so incredibly powerful that it does overwhelm you, even as an objective scientist. And I'll always remember drifting over the wreck of Titanic in a submersible 2.5 miles down and lighting up an area where the lifeboats had been launched, and at the site of lifeboat 8, remembering and looking at that with the davit swung out with ropes still dangling, that this was the lifeboat that Isidore and Ida Strauss had not gotten into. And this couple, older, married many years, children and grandchildren, still very much in love with each other. And with her understanding, as did he, that on that night, this women and children first really meant women and children only. That boat wasn't completely full. She was in that boat crying with her mate. He stood by with other men. She didn't understand because there were empty seats, but there were no more women and children to go into the boat. She went to get out. The officer asked her to get back. He said, "Mr. Strauss, I'm sure nobody would mind if a gentleman of your age would get in." And he said, "No, I cannot, I will not." And indeed, I think these days we see people fight to get onto that boat. But then there was a different code. And indeed, at that stage, there were some men who survived who got into boats and their wives divorced them because they now saw those men as cowards. but not Isidor Straus. So Mrs. Strauss got out of the boat and decided to leave. And as the officer tried to get her back in, she basically said that he didn't understand. She'd been with this man her entire life, and she loved him, and where he went, she went. And that's a story you can read, something you can catch a glimpse of in a movie. And there you are, suspended in the eternal dark and the cold, 2.5 miles down in a sub over Titanic. And that scene is lit up before you. And in your mind's eye, you can practically see it play out, and you are literally there, several feet away. That's one of those few times where I actually cried on a wreck, because if you've ever loved, really loved, and understood that and lost, then you get it.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We do have a couple of questions in our chat room. The first one is, when ships like the ones you've talked about are found, who owns the artifacts that are within them? And how is it decided what is brought up for restoration or display? And are there any salvage rights to anything for those who found them?
It's a complex question. Basically, for all warships, they still belong to the country that owned them. And had them in commission. And that's an important legal principle, because it's the same basic law that protects embassies and consulates. We, as well as other nations, follow those rules. As long as there's been a United States, any warship that flew that flag and was foundered, lost, or was sunk, even sunk by an enemy in battle, it remains the part of the property of the United States Navy, and that by that, the people of the United States. So nobody can go down and take things off of it without consequences. Merchant vessels, it depends. In some cases, those vessels were owned and insured, and those companies still might have rights. There's admiralty law, which allows for salvage and recovery. In some cases with private vessels, you have to go before court and be named a salver in possession. And with that, then you have the right to recover. That law was basically set up in the past for things that had just gotten into trouble. It's been applied for centuries-old vessels since then. Generally, I think that type of activity has been falling off, because it's rare to find a ship packed full of gold or silver. And the number one thing anybody finds when they do find something like that and they seek to salvage it is that all sorts of other people start coming forward. And the largest amount of money that's made is made by those who are actually in court. It's the lawyers, as people fight each other over the right to salvage. In terms of what comes up and doesn't come up, it all depends. In many cases, some people say, let's leave it. Excuse me, let's leave it there in the Museum of the Sea. But in other cases, they do come up. They require expensive treatment, and then they go into a museum because they've changed chemically from all their time in the bottom of the sea. And if you just bring them up and let them dry out, they'll fall apart. Even ceramic and glass, sometimes the salt will get in and the crystals will expand and will break. So with that, we're always careful and thoughtful about what we do. And we always make sure that there's the funding in place and a darn good reason. It's going to answer an important question, or it's something that's going to tell a powerful story in a museum. And then with that, then the decision's made to recover it. Archaeologists will completely excavate a shipwreck to learn more about it, and everything goes into a museum then. And in all my years of working on this, I have excavated a number of ships. I've brought things up. I have found all of 3 coins ever that end up in a museum, or in the collections, and that's just simply because most ships didn't sail with big piles of money. So hopefully that answers it. I know there's a couple aspects of it I didn't, but I think that give you a basic sense.
Next question is, do you find that there is interest in today's youth in some of these wrecks, especially the stories that they tell about our nation and the people who are on them?
Absolutely. And I find that I speak often to classes and to kids. And I've sat down and on the floor and talked to kindergarten classes about this. And yeah, you'd be amazed. Let's say you have kindergartners in your family, how smart they are and what they get. But no, there's always interest. I think some of these stories are timeless. And the fact that the ships are down there is compelling and powerful. Many of them, of course, in earlier years when Titanic had just been made into the movie by Jim Cameron. Certainly Titanic always got a lot of attention and interest. But it's that idea of a ship, of a wreck, of this ghost town sitting at the bottom of the sea, the sharks swimming in and out, all of those things that could fire the imagination, as well as for those who simply say, that's going to a whole other place. That's a frontier. I want to be an explorer like that. And in that, so many places to go. And in answer to the question I just saw flash up, there's probably some 2 million shipwrecks out there around the world, which means there's one in everybody's backyard, basically. And that includes rivers and lakes. Arizona has 6 shipwrecks in the Colorado River. 5 of them left over from the early river explorations with the large boats, and then a steamship that was dismantled and put together to work for mining and carrying goods back and forth up the river, and then abandoned after it was used in 1916. So shipwrecks everywhere.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. Next, we have a 3-part question. The first is, what types of entities are engaged in shipwreck recovery efforts, and how are they funded?
Very few people are engaged in shipwreck recovery as opposed to shipwreck exploration. And it varies from governments who wish to seek and find their own lost warships. The US Navy has the Navy History and Heritage Command, for example. Other agencies, the National Park Service and NOAA, because there are national marine sanctuaries and national parks that have wrecks in them, under federal law for historic preservation reasons, they need to find them and figure out what's down there, which ones are significant, which ones they can make available and share with the public, either through dive trails or through displays or exhibits. And most recently, NOAA just was out off of the Outer Banks of North Carolina with robotic systems revisiting the Monitor, as well as wrecks sunk by German U-boats and a German U-boat in World War II. So there's some of those groups. You have a few commercial companies that still go out to try to find treasure and recover it. And then you have companies like the one I work for now, where we will work on a project because a wreck needs to be assessed or documented or studied or protected because it's in an area that's going to be dredged. They're going to build a bridge over it, or it's so important, like the last slave ship, that the state comes up with money and says, tell us all you can about it and what can be done to preserve it in the future. So that's a thumbnail, but that's what's out there. Plus those who a large number of my friends and colleagues who are driven by this need to explore and to find these things and for the opportunity to do so, like the group that just recently found the Endurance.
Great. The last 2 parts to that question is, how many World War II US warships went down in the Pacific, and how many have been located of those? And are there still active search and recovery efforts for those that have not?
I can't remember the exact numbers, but I want to say all told well over 1,000. Of those that have been found, anything shallow, largely yes. Even in the deeper ones, more recently, thanks to the work of Paul Allen, Victor Vescovo, and others, we've been finding more of these, like the USS Johnston, which is 13,000 feet down. As to everything being found, no, not yet. Of the 58 submarines that went missing in World War II, only a handful have been rediscovered as of late and still remain out there. And there's a nonprofit foundation that is working actively on finding those. Active work, hard to say. More often than not, many of us, as you will find, are the type of hunter who never tell our friends we're going deer hunting until we drive up and there's that deer on the hood of the car.
Well said. The last part to that question is, do you see a future for 3D virtual reality experiences for some of these dives?
The future is now. Some of my colleagues and friends are already doing that, and I think it's going to be a key thing. I've always thought of the opportunity to take everything we've done and to put you into a virtual reality experience where you could walk the deck of Titanic 2.5 miles down, hovering in a submersible with 2 other people. This is a 6-foot diameter thing, looking through a porthole like this with the lights on and seeing Titanic. Water was so clear, and you're there, so you forget that you're in the sub. It's like I could just fit in there. I could go through that door. I could even go through that window. You get that sense, and then you realize, no, it's 6,000 pounds per square inch out there. The water's freezing. It's just you're not going to make it. It's like opening a capsule door in space, you're gone. And there's no spacesuit capable of protecting you and those kind of pressures down there. But the thought of, wow, we really scanned it and did this right. You could VR it. And that's just like, now there's a wow moment. If, you know, for something like Titanic or other wrecks, absolutely. And with that, I mean, one has to be respectful and careful. I mean, I have seen traces of people in wrecks. I would not want to include that in that experience. And we don't release images as a general rule of that sort of thing. But to actually, you go to archaeological sites, you go to an ancient ruin, virtual reality experiences of places like that are now becoming more popular. For those of us who can't bear the altitude or the hike or have the money to go to Machu Picchu, for example, virtual reality tours there, going to the Forum of Rome, the pyramids, or these vast undersea graveyards and these ships that are down. Yeah, good question. And yeah, I think more and more of that's going to be coming out probably in the next year or two.
That's great. We're excited to see that. 2 more questions that we have in the chat room. The first is, there are many anchors on display in Pearl Harbor and other locations in Hawaii. Have they all been identified?
I don't know the answer to that.
All right. Our last question of the day, is there a particular wreck that you would really like to find? And what is it about it that makes it so?
There's not a particular wreck. I've got a long list of wrecks, actually, that I'd like to see found. I don't need to find them, because the one thing I will say is that there's many of us who work on this. It's a relatively small group, but there's a number of us who work on this sort of thing. And with that, many of us do what we do because we feel a responsibility to tell that story, to find that wreck, to bring that closure, and to do these things. And in that, in many ways, we work like a group of lighthouses as beacons to say, look here, here's something, or, you know, follow this path. Lighthouses don't compete, they work together. And so many of us do. Oftentimes we might not tell each other what we're doing, but more often than not, we do, and share and talk. And in that, everybody has a list. The second half of my answer on that is, you never know. I had a list of wrecks I thought I'd like to see or find. The last slave ship, other wrecks, Independence, they'd not originally been on that list. It's sometimes what's amazing is you're doing a project and something comes forward and you learn more about it. And in that, you've picked up a book, you've met a new friend, you've gained insights into something. And therein comes that whole point of why part of staying alive and staying younger is always being able to learn. And that's what I love. Like I said at the start, I'm still that 6th grader deep inside who was fascinated by all this. And that kid's light still burns bright. And so any and every shipwreck has a story to tell. And it's what lies ahead down below that still keeps me fired up.
Well, Dr. Delgado, I think we've run out of time. We thank you for this wonderful presentation. You're certainly an inspiration and a wealth of knowledge. I think everyone learned something new today. So thank you for that. For all of our fans out there who joined today, thank you for joining us for this Mojo event. Please be on the lookout for future Mojo events. We hope you can attend. In the meantime, follow us on social media, and a shout out to our partners, the Old Salt Coffee Company, for supporting this series of events. Dr. Delgado, thank you again for your time and joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Delgado. Fascinating.
Thank you.